Imagine buying a house in 1990. You take out a 30-year mortgage. Every month, you make the payment. You raise a family there. Your children grow up. And by 2020, the house is finally yours. 30 years is an incredibly long time. Long enough to build highways. Long enough to transform cities. Long enough for an entire generation to grow up. But in Kelantan, there is another 30-year story. A story not about owning a house, but about something far more basic. Turning on a tap and expecting clean, reliable water to come out. And somehow, after more than 3 decades under the same political administration, that expectation has remained uncertain for many Kelantan residents. So what happened? In October 1990, Malaysia's Islamic Party, PAS, returned to power in Kelantan. It has governed the state continuously ever since. By 2026, that means roughly 36 years of uninterrupted PAS-led state government. This doesn't mean Kelantan had a perfect water system in 1990. It didn't. Water infrastructure takes decades to develop, and some of today's problems have roots stretching further back. But uninterrupted government creates something other administrations rarely receive. Time. Time to plan. Time to replace aging infrastructure. Time to correct mistakes. And time to build institutions capable of maintaining the system. In 1995, responsibility for Kelantan's water supply was transferred from the State Water Supply Department, Kelantan Water, Sendirian Berhad. The company would eventually become what residents know today as Air Kelantan, Sendirian Berhad. The idea was straightforward. Run the water system through a dedicated company responsible for treatment, distribution, billing, and the development of the state's water needs. But the problems didn't disappear. By 2011, an assessment of Kelantan's water services was describing something disturbingly familiar. Frequent disruptions, homes with meters but unreliable supply, and complaints involving dirty, murky, or colored water. Think about that date. PAS had already governed Kelantan continuously for more than 20 years. And yet, the basic water problem was already serious enough to become the subject of a dedicated case study. There was improvement in some areas. SPAN data showed water supply coverage increasing from 64.7% to 68% in 2017. But that also meant roughly 1/3 of the state's population was still outside the reported coverage of the public water supply system. And behind the scenes, another problem was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The pipes. Water utilities use a measurement called non-revenue water, or NRW. Imagine a treatment plant produces 100 liters of treated water. Not all 100 liters reach customers and become properly billed consumption. Some escapes through leaking or broken pipes. Some can be lost because of inaccurate meters or other system losses. That's NRW. And in Kelantan, the number became extraordinary. In 2023, Kelantan's NRW rate stood at 54.5%, more than half. Not necessarily half leaking directly into the ground because NRW includes several forms of loss, but it meant that more than half of treated water entering the distribution calculation was not becoming billed consumption. Imagine running a factory where more than half of what you produce fails to become revenue. Then imagine trying to finance new infrastructure with what remains. Old pipes were an important part of the problem. In 2022, PAAB announced a RM65 million project to replace more than 103 kilometers of old piping in Kelantan, specifically aimed at reducing leakage and NRW. But replacing a century-scale network isn't quick. Digging up roads, replacing mains, building reservoirs, and upgrading treatment plants can take years, which raises another question. Why did the system reach this condition in the first place? To understand responsibility, we have to complicate the story. Because Kelantan's water problem isn't simply PAS controls Kelantan, therefore PAS pays for and controls everything. Malaysia's water system doesn't work like that. Under National Water Sector Reforms, PAAB, a federally owned water asset company, finances and develops much of the major water infrastructure. SPAN regulates the operators. The state water company operates and maintains the system and provides the service to consumers. Kelantan formally joined this restructuring framework in 2016. As part of the deal, PAAB agreed to take over about RM 604 million in Kelantan water-related loans, while financing future upgrades, renewals, and new infrastructure. That matters, because it means the claim that Kelantan received absolutely no federal assistance would be inaccurate. Federal-linked financing became an important part of rebuilding the system. In 2022, PAAB announced another RM 471 million for 9 new water treatment plants, and the upgrading of another plant expected to add around 125 million liters per day of capacity. And in 2024, the federal government allocated another RM 69, 18 million under the National NRW program, specifically to help Kelantan reduce water losses. So money was going in. Projects were being built. Pipes were being replaced. Yet the numbers still told a difficult story. The Auditor General's report released in 2024 found that Kelantan had the lowest treated water supply coverage in Malaysia, 73.9%. Malaysia is not a desert. Kelantan isn't lacking rivers or rainfall. The problem is turning raw water into sufficiently treated water and then reliably transporting it through thousands of kilometers of infrastructure into people's homes. At the same time, Kelantan faced another basic problem. It simply wasn't producing enough treated water to comfortably meet demand. In early 2024, the federal deputy minister responsible for the sector said Kelantan was facing a deficit of about 61.1 million liters per day. SPAN had approved RM 521 2 million in capital expenditure for AKSB, covering the 2021 to 2024 operating periods. So the crisis wasn't caused by one broken pipe. It was a system problem. Treatment capacity, aging infrastructure, high NRW, distribution, financing, maintenance, population demand, and decades of catching up. This is where the story becomes political. Supporters of Kelantan state government can reasonably point out that massive water infrastructure requires federal institutions, federal financing, and cooperation between different levels of government. And historically, relations between PAS-governed Kelantan and various federal administrations haven't always been smooth. That context matters. But there is another side. AKSB is the operator responsible for providing water services in Kelantan, and the state government has remained under essentially the same political administration since 1990. 36 years is enough time for accountability to become unavoidable. Not necessarily accountability for creating every old pipe, but accountability for how quickly those pipes were replaced, for how the operator was managed, for whether investment priorities were correct, for whether NRW was brought under control, and for whether basic service improved quickly enough. Federal responsibility doesn't erase state responsibility. And state responsibility doesn't erase the federal role. Both can exist at the same time. Go back to that house. A young Kelantanese couple buying one in 1990 could have signed a 30-year mortgage. They could have raised children, watched those children become adults, paid the final installment, and owned the house outright. Meanwhile, the political administration governing their state could remain essentially unchanged throughout the entire journey. Of course, a water system isn't a mortgage. A house eventually gets paid off. Water infrastructure never does. Pipes age. Plants require maintenance. Populations grow. Technology changes. Investment must continue forever. But that is precisely why governments exist. Not simply to build infrastructure, but to maintain it across generations. Kelantan's water crisis cannot honestly be reduced to one politician, one broken pipe, one funding dispute, or one political party. It is the accumulated result of infrastructure, financing, management, federal-state relations, and decisions stretching across decades. But 36 years creates a very simple question that no complicated explanation can completely erase. If a generation is long enough to buy and finish paying for a home, how long should a citizen have to wait for reliable, clean water? For Kelantan, the answer is still being written. And according to the latest plans, that story may continue all the way to 2030. More than 3 decades after this political era began, Kelantan was still building its way out of the problem. In May 2026, the state government acknowledged that its 43 existing water treatment plants were still insufficient. Together, they could produce about 529 million liters per day, and supply disruptions were still affecting districts including Tumpat and Pasir Mas. The state said 17 additional treatment plants, initiated from 2023, were expected to be completed by 2030. If completed as planned, Kelantan would have 60 plants with combined capacity of approximately 884 million liters per day. But even the state official announcing that expansion cautioned that the additional capacity could significantly reduce the problem without necessarily eliminating it completely. There is significant work happening. By June 2026, officials said 64 water-related projects were at various stages across Kelantan. 23 completed, 17 under construction, 14 being designed, and 10 still in planning. Funding involved not only the state government, but PAAB, federal ministries, SPAN, and other agencies. So this isn't a story where nothing was done. Far from it. The more difficult question is, why did so much still need to be done after so much time? If this story stayed with you, follow History After Dark for more real stories from history's darkest corners.